All right, the Union in Peril, 1848 to 1861. Really, this is the time period when the country is tearing itself apart and ultimately leading us to civil war. And all of these different parties are just boiling in a pot and eventually bubble over. So we have some problems leading up to and into 1850 to 1860. Some sectional balance that is happening. Sectionalism is the term that is used to describe this time period when the North and South were divided economically, politically, culturally. So some of these issues included what would happen with California and their statehood. You had Southern, what we call that were called fire eaters, just feisty politicians who were threatening secession if they didn't get their way. And you had at the same time an underground railroad and a fugitive slave issues that were in direct contrast with how the law was interpreting not only property and what property was, but also what was personal liberty at this time. I didn't realize it did that. All right, conflict over the status of territory. So this is the time period of manifest destiny. And the country, there's the bell, is expanding. We go to war with Mexico to gain some territory. We have the gold rush in the West. And we're going to cover all that in the next unit more in detail and depth. But what you need to know for now is that we are gaining more territory west of the Mississippi. And more Americans are pushing into that territory. So what do we do with those places when they want to become states? And abolitionists were pushing for them to be anti-slave or free of slaves, and people in the South were pushing to have them open to slavery. So you have this sort of delicate balance in 1850 of 15 free slave states and 15 slave states. And then the war breaks out and we gain all this territory, so what do? Well, the Wilmot Proviso was proposed in Congress, and it would have banned slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico in the war with Mexico. It was added as kind of an amendment to a budget bill, and it passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate, and that is because the South had greater representation in the Senate. And so you also have these abolitionists in the North who are pushing and supporting the Wilmot Proviso and don't want slavery to be expanded, and in fact they want to get rid of it altogether. In the South, most whites viewed the restrictions to slavery as a violation of their constitutional rights to own property. So again, this gets into some pretty touchy issues with how we view property, states' rights, all kinds of stuff going on here. So a compromise solution comes up in 1850 because tempers are really flying and people are threatening to secede already in 1850. And so it's decided that instead of letting Congress decide, the people of the region would decide. And this is that concept of popular sovereignty. So the Compromise of 1850 was sort of fueled by all of these tempers, as well as this gold rush in California and the war with Mexico. And California is admitted under the Compromise of 1850 as a free state. The Southerners wanted to extend this compromise line from Missouri Compromise line all the way to the coast, which would have opened Southern California and the Southwest to slavery. There is a drive to keep these places free from the North, and in the South they wanted to be able to expand. Texas gives up territorial claims to New Mexico as a result of this compromise. California, as I said, was admitted as free and then undivided. That line was not extended. And the principle of popular sovereignty was put in place so that all of these future territories would be able to decide and vote for themselves whether or not they will be slave or free. Now that becomes contentious later, as we will see. It also banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but allowed whites in Washington to continue to own slaves, and it was the adoption of the new Fugitive Slave Law, and that law would be enforced. And that becomes pretty controversial in itself. So the Fugitive Slave Law, this is where slaves, who particularly are leaving on the Underground Railroad, escape into northern states. Well, the Fugitive Slave Law, as passed by part of this Compromise of 1850, said that they could send bounty hunters to track down their slaves and return them to the South. And there were people in the Underground Railroad that were helping escape slaves, but it wasn't very organized, and they're not really sure how many people got out that way. And people in the North really were opposed to this enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. They saw it as inhumane and a violation of their states' rights as well. Around this time, you have a very popular book which comes on the scene, which is called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was portrayed in plays and dramatic readings, and she really portrayed slavery as cruel and unjust. And particularly in the North, really turns popular opinions against slavery as an institution in the United States. You also have the political parties in crisis at this point. The Whigs start to fade out. Remember, they formed as a result of their opposition to Andrew Jackson. The Democrats are really struggling at this time as well. They don't have really strong party leadership. They're trying to compromise and get a hold of some of these bigger slavery issues, and compromise was unpopular among really diehard slaveholding states. So they were splitting their votes. And then you have a new party that comes on the scene called the Know Nothing Party, and they were actually a nativist party who were openly hostile to immigrants, primarily those Irish and Germans that we've talked about. And they also opposed Catholics and other immigrants from Southern Europe. At this time, you also have the birth of the Republican Party, a new party on the scene. So the Republicans start to form, and they create in sort of 1854 a reaction to, and part of their platform, to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we'll show in a few minutes. And they were a coalition of free soilers, anti-slavery Whigs, who weren't really satisfied with the Whig Party, and Democrats who were opposed to slavery. They were content to see slavery continue as long as they confined it to old slave states. They weren't really super psyched about it moving further west, but they weren't really about abolition either. Those were the free soilers that were doing that. So in 1860, the Republican Party platform looked like this. Non-extension of slavery. This was to get the free soilers on board. A protective tariff for the northern industrialists. So you can see that was another part of their voter base. No abridgment of rights for immigrants. This was a disappointment to the know-nothings and kind of turned them away from that party. Government should aid to build the Pacific Railroad for the Northwest. That's again appealing to those northern industrialists who wanted those raw materials from the West brought to the markets in the East. Internal improvements for the West at federal expense. So we'll get into this with Manifest Destiny, but the role the railroad played in expanding in the West and how the government really underwrote that whole program. And free homestead for the public domain, meaning free land for farmers, which was a hugely popular program starting in the 1860s, was the Homestead Act. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Democrats were controlling the House of Representatives and the White House. Stephen Douglas devised a plan to expand the railroads west, but he needed Southern approval, and he's a Southerner, and he realizes that, and people in the South were kind of complaining that this isn't really helping the South, it's really only helping the North and the West. So he compromises and he introduces a bill that proposes that the Nebraska Territory be divided into two territories, the Kansas and the Nebraska Territory. And then settlers would move in and would be able to decide through popular sovereignty whether they would be free or slave or not. This sort of reheats that sectional controversy all over again. So here you can see the division in the old Nebraska Territory into the Kansas and the Nebraska Territory up here. And again, you can see it here as well, the Kansas territory. And it's this Kansas territory that plays a role in, oh, that stinks. That just says Kansas-Nebraska Act. Shoot, I don't know why I did that. Weird. Anyway, that plays a role in what becomes known as an event called Bleeding Kansas. So here you can see the division between the North and the South, the sectionalism. These were open to slavery by popular sovereignty. These folks voted for slavery. These folks opposed it. California entered as a free state. So, Bleeding Kansas. Slaveholders from Missouri established homestead in Kansas as a way to win control of this territory for the South. So, people moved in for the purpose of voting in Kansas to make it a slave state. Free soilers then responded with their own anti-slavery settlers. Fights started to break out among the groups in 1856 and spilled over into Congress, where Senator Sumner was actually beaten by Senator Brooks and was actually beaten with a cane. It was a pretty infamous situation in Congress. So when we think that Congress doesn't work together well now, at least they're not beating each other with canes. So, Bleeding Kansas, you had border ruffians, pro-slavery Missourians moving in to, and you can see how close to the border with Missouri this was, and all of the areas where there were attacks by pro-slavery forces in this new Kansas territory. And actual fights broke out, riots broke out. John Brown, who later becomes a character in the pre-Civil War movement even later, gets sort of his start as a abolitionist, a radical abolitionist in this fight in Kansas at this time. At this time, you also have the Lee-Compton Constitution, which is proposed, which was a very pro-slavery constitution in Kansas. And President Buchanan rejects it, and that creates even more tensions, causes him some issues with re-election. And then the Supreme Court decides in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. And Dred Scott was a slave who was moved with his master into a free state. And when he got there, he sued for his freedom, basically, saying, I'm in a free state, I'm a human being, and I am no longer a slave. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in this case that Dred Scott was not, in fact, a citizen, and they used sort of the Three-Fifths Compromise as evidence of that, and that because he was not a citizen, he actually did not have any rights to sue whatsoever. So, not being a citizen, he was therefore property. And they also sided with his master, saying that no one could be deprived of their property without due process. And since slaves were property, Congress could not exclude slavery from any territory because they would be violating those slaveholders' property rights. Once again, people making awesome decisions about humans and calling them property and treating them as such. They then come to the conclusion that the Missouri Compromise was therefore unconstitutional. Stephen Douglas, proponent of popular sovereignty, a Democrat, runs against a new Republican candidate for Senate by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And they held a series of debates, which are called now the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was against the expansion of slavery. And in fact, the quote there is attributed to him. This government cannot inter permanently half slave and half free. He also said a house divided among itself cannot stand. So he was very much aware that this was tearing the nation apart. Sort of a precursor to their battle for the White House, which comes later. So John Brown, after his exploits in Kansas, then takes on some bigger issues. And the question then becomes, is he a martyr or a madman? And we'll stop there, and I will pick up in a few minutes with part 2.